All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to take a look at some updates around the ongoing war in Gaza. We've got some pretty wild drone footage we'll run through to start, some updates on the Shifa hospital raid, some public missteps by Israel, and then China and Russia earlier today vetoed a U.S. ceasefire proposal at the UN Security Council. So, everybody is getting along. Now, starting with this drone footage, I'll go ahead and play it here. Israel just released this a couple days ago. It is a small drone, tiny little drone flying through a building, and they've used this in tunnels as well to scout ahead and try to identify booby traps or armed Hamas militants waiting to ambush Israeli forces when they move in. It's a bad day for that guy. Looks like he was kind of caught off guard, didn't exactly know what to do. Now, the rest of the video here is the drone flies outside, is recovered by Israeli forces. Israeli forces move inside and eliminate that threat. Now, I believe the type of drone that we're seeing here is the Lanius, which is an Israeli manufactured, I believe, small quadcopter that can be lethal. It can be a loiter munition, also can just take pictures and videos like we saw there. So they say the Lanius is a highly maneuverable and versatile drone-based loiter munition designed for short-range operation in the urban environment. So even some of the smaller drones that we're seeing in this war or being used in Ukraine, the smaller quadcopters or FPVs, those are very, very challenging, even for the best drone operator to move inside of a building like that. It's hard to explain just how qualified the drone operator has to be able to move into a building and go from one room to the next through these doors and half closed doors to identify what's around each corner. That's why I rather than the off-the-shelf quadcopters, which are a little bit bigger than the Lanius, I think that's probably what they're using here, this Lanius drone. Again, there are some options where they can attach some sort of warhead, small collateral damage type warhead, and be able to strike that target in the moment. Whereas in this case, it looks like they were just gathering footage, relaying that back to IDF forces waiting outside. Now, a couple days ago, Israel kicked off a new raid around the Shifa hospital. We've got some updates there. They say that they have so far captured 650 terror operatives during the ongoing operation at the Shifa hospital. They say this includes several senior Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad commanders. Now, one of the challenges here, and this is going to be an issue for Israel going forward, we'll have to wait and see how this war shakes out, but as they've moved through, they did not remove all civilians from northern and central Gaza, right? So as they pushed through, some moved back in from the south and others stayed put throughout. And then, of course, you've got these tunnel networks. So what we're seeing already, and this is going to be a theme for quite a while, I would imagine, is even after Israel moves through some of these areas and clears some of these complexes like Shifa, just the nature of this war, the nature of the threat that is Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they're going to be able to reoccupy those areas in some way, shape, or form. That's what we saw play out here. Israel says among those that were captured were a handful of high-value targets, or named targets, I should say. One was Hassam Salameh, the commander of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad's Observation and Intelligence Unit, as well as his brother, Wissam Salahem, the head of the terror group's Palestinian Islamic Jihad's propaganda unit in Gaza City. They say they also captured at Shifa 3 senior officers in Hamas's West Bank headquarters, which they say is tasked with advancing attacks against Israel from the West Bank. Which has been an interesting piece. I feel like from the beginning of this war, people were saying there's no Hamas in the West Bank, but Hamas themselves will congratulate their fighters in the West Bank when they carry out attacks against Israel. So maybe a coordination cell is a better way to describe these 3 guys. Israel says that so far, amid these raids, they have killed more than 140 gunmen, is the term they used. And they say during scans of the hospital, weapons and intelligence documents were seized. The fighting at Shifa is still ongoing and is expected to last several more days until all of the terror operatives in the area are captured or killed. The intelligence documents being seized kind of goes under the radar in a lot of these operations. But in this type, or really in any kind of war, but very important in this type of low-intensity conflict, if you will, fighting an insurgent organization, a terrorist organization, being able to move through any sort of facility, and whether it's on the body of the dead militants or there's some sort of small mobile headquarters, you can capture those phones, computers, documents. That helps with the targeting of the next cycle. So it might tip off where Israel can go next to go after some of the people that these militants were communicating with in the days and hours leading up to this raid. Now, this is still getting a little bit of coverage in Palestinian media, really nothing coming from Hamas or the Qassam brigades. Qassam continues to say that they're engaging Israeli forces around the hospital, so speaking to the ongoing fight. Al Jazeera did cover this, although it was a couple of days ago. Again, kind of sparse coverage considering some of the initial claims that were coming from these organizations. Al Jazeera quoted Hamas, who they say condemned what they called Israel's bloody massacre at Al-Shifa and said that civilians, patients, and displaced people were among the fatalities. The Al Jazeera article also quoted the Gaza government media office, who they denied Israel's military claims of having killed fighters. They said that all of the dead in Shifa Hospital were wounded patients and displaced peoples. So again, that's kind of going back to the original claims from Hamas, Al Jazeera, and Qassam, really, that the only people being killed in this operation are medical providers, patients, displaced people, civilians, no militants in and around the hospital. That is continues to be the claim from Al Jazeera and Hamas. Now, looking at some documents that Israel has released from this raid, they put out this picture here that I'll share that has 358 confirmed terror operatives that they say they captured in Shifa. Remember, they say that they've captured over 650 at this point. So these are the pictures of 358. In this picture, as soon as they released this, people started digging through this, saying, well, we identify some of those people as key leaders in Hamas. One that I'll show here was listed as Rod Saad, who is considered to be one of Hamas's chief of operations, a very senior leader in Hamas. But this release of this collage of faces was interesting. It was walked back by Israel. Shortly thereafter, they put out a statement saying, due to human error, there are several photos in this graphic of terrorists who have not yet been caught, but who are, according to the information we have, in the area of the hospital and are holed up there. And a couple thoughts on this. First off, don't release the pictures of who you think is there and kind of insinuate that those are people that have already been captured. There's no good reason to do that, right? Until they're actually in custody or killed, these people could be anywhere. I think we've seen that already throughout this war. Israel moves into an area they believe is going to be filled with Hamas operatives, and there's one or two or zero. So surprising that they put that forward in the way that they did. Also, and we've already seen it today, when they are able to kill or capture senior Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas leaders, they have pictures, names, and titles that go along with them. In this case, they just threw up a picture of a bunch of military-aged males, which very well could be full of Hamas militants, but it also could just be 20 to 30-year-old men that live in Gaza. This was a weird situation for Israel to throw up this graphic the way that they did. And that comes alongside a pretty big misstep by an Israeli officer who said something that I think is just going to feed into the information war here. The commander of the 7th Armored Brigade's 82nd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Caspi, told reporters recently that the solution to defeating Hamas in Gaza is establishing settlements, which is counter to the official Israeli statements about the goals and the plans for this war. He is saying that the way to do this is to kick the Palestinians out and move Israelis into Gaza to reoccupy some of that territory. That is going to trigger a lot of alarm bells, and rightfully so. In his statement here, he said the IDF should hold the territory. I think that if the settlements return here, we have won. If we kill Sinwar, we will not destroy Hamas. Someone else will come. The solution is to return here like the settlements in Judea and Samaria, he said. The IDF said that they summoned him to speak with the division commander, who reprimanded him for his irregular remarks, which are not in line with IDF protocols and what is expected of an IDF commander. They went on to say the officer took back his words and expressed regret. Now, I feel like this is one of those things that can be interpreted on both extreme ends of the spectrum. I would say that this is not a slip-up. A slip-up is using the wrong name for a town. Or yesterday I was trying to refer to Hamas drones and I said Israeli drones. That's a slip-up. This is a policy proposal that he's putting forward. The slip-up, if anything, would be that he said it publicly. Now, the other side of this is Israeli military officers do not make policy. This option of resettling Gaza with Israeli civilians is also not documented as being an official Israeli policy anywhere. But it is a concern of a lot of people, especially when we're talking about the possibility of a ceasefire or how do you get the Palestinian civilians out of certain areas. One of the pushbacks there has been them concerned that they're not going to be permitted back once they leave. So any statement like this, while it is not an official Israeli statement, it is coming from an Israeli government official, in a sense. I mean, he is an Israeli leader, right? He's not a government leader, but he's a leader within the IDF. And this type of statement, this kind of unofficial statement, it's not policy, but it's what a leadership figure within Israel said, is kind of the core of South Africa's argument that Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza. If you go back and look at what South Africa presented to the ICJ, the majority of their testimony and their proof was not pulling out Israel policy documents and official statements from any organization within Israel. It was looking at just random statements off the cuff in interviews that Israeli officials said. And this is the kind of thing that I'm sure people will point to and say, that is what the actual Israeli plan is. Whether it is or it isn't, it's going to fuel that fire. I'm sure of it. Then for the fourth time since this war began, the United Nations Security Council failed to pass a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. This time around, it was China and Russia vetoing a U.S. proposal for an end to the hostilities. It looks like 11 member states voted in favor of the resolution, 1 abstained, Algeria voted against, and then China and Russia vetoed it. I'm going to go through some of the text of the resolution here, but this feels very political, more than most. So what that text called for, and this is a U.S. proposed text, right? So the United States put this forward to the United Nations. They called for an immediate and sustained ceasefire with an urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance to all civilians and lifting all barriers to delivering aid at scale to Gazans. It called for Israel and all armed groups must comply with their obligations under international law, providing protection for humanitarian workers and medical personnel. It condemns all acts of terrorism, including the Hamas-led attacks of 7 October, the taking and killing of hostages, murder of civilians, sexual violence, and condemns the use of civilian buildings for military purposes. It also rejects any forced displacement of civilians in Gaza. Now, in reading through the arguments as to why China and Russia vetoed this resolution, it's hard to see anything other than just politics at play, which is a political body in a sense, right? So that's to be expected. And that's kind of what U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said, saying that Russia and China are putting politics above trying to make any sort of meaningful progress around this war. And she said that those two countries don't want the United States to be associated with any positive outcome of this conflict. So if the United States is the one that puts forward a proposal that ends up being accepted by the United Nations, that looks good for the United States. And China and Russia don't want that, so they're going to end up vetoing it. I mean, the arguments by China and Russia here are that they said it's not enough and the council must demand a ceasefire. So they're just kind of dialing in on these little words of you have to demand a ceasefire instead of what the U.S. has in the text makes imperative an immediate and sustained ceasefire. It's kind of semantics. And again, Russia and China said that this was a very political document at its core, and they're going to put something forward that is not political in the future. Now, to be fair, it's not as though a UN Security Council resolution is binding. Right? It's not like if this passed today, then tomorrow the fighting would all stop in Gaza. There's a long ways to go. Even if this is agreed upon by all member states of the UN Security Council, there's a long ways to go before there's actually a ceasefire achieved or an end to the war achieved in Gaza. But either way, for the fourth time since the war began, the UN Security Council had members veto the possibility of a ceasefire in Gaza. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, linked in the description below. Substack's kind of like a mix between a newsletter and a website. We put out 3 to 4 articles there every week that I think are pretty interesting, at least. The last few here, one was talking about the cyber war going on between Russia and Ukraine. Before that, talking about some issues China is having with Afghanistan related to trying to expand Chinese influence across the region, and then how the Mexican cartels are essentially becoming a pretty significant military force over the past couple years. Again, I'll link that in the description below. Those articles are all free. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.